Good morning, students. Today we will close the chapter with that personality, perception, and the learning. Yesterday we see with the up to what is the learning and what is the factors that affect learning and the process with regard to learning. So, what is the learning? Learning is what it is the predetermined facts or the what is that? It is the permanent change in the behavior of a person permanently changed that occur as a result of the experience and the studies. So, as a result of the experience and the studies, the relatively permanent change in one's behavior. Maybe that behavior it is for a big life period. That change will be for a big life period. Means if the individual reacts or responds based on the experience which is different from others, that person is said to have acquired a new learning or experience aspect. So, they need to get the study with regard to that from the experience they observed. So, if they observed that experience, then maybe based on that they will study and progress further. So that is the relatively permanent change in the one person's behavior due to experience. So that is the relatively permanent change. Some changes to be occurred, and based on the experience they saw or they observed from that change, one person's learning habit is to be changed also. So that is first process. Then salient features with regard to learning process that also we see yesterday. One is the change process, one is the permanent change, another one is the setting the behavioral action, and one more is the need for meaningful experiences. So what are these? Change processes there. Means based on the observation they did, they may change it. So that is the change process. So learning involves some changes in the oneself in terms of the observable action explicitly shown to others, then others of the change in one's attitude or the thought process. That is the change process. So it involves some change in oneself. എന്തോ ഒരു വ്യത്യാസം ഉണ്ടാകും. So that is the change process. So learning involves some change process or change in oneself in terms of the observable action explicitly shown to others or change in one's attitude or thought process. Change may be good or bad. If it is a good decision or good changing, then for the entire lifespan of the business, lifespan of that individual, it is going to change. While if it is of a bad result, then that person will hold the prejudices or bias. ഞാൻ അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഇത് വന്നത്, അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ഒരു ബയസ്, ഒരു എന്താ പറയുന്നത്, ഒരു തോട്ട്, അങ്ങനെ തെറ്റായ ഒരു ധാരണ പുള്ളിക്ക് വരുന്നു. So that is the first case, change process. Another one is the permanent change. Permanent change means what? Due to whatever exposure a person encounters, means faces, എന്തെല്ലാം ചേഞ്ചസ് ഒരു വ്യക്തിക്ക് ഫേസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരുന്നു, then the impact what it generates may be long lasting and it is for permanent in nature. അതായത് എന്തെല്ലാം ചേഞ്ചസ് ഫേസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരുന്നു, that thing should be of a permanent nature. That is for the entire lifespan. He may change his behavior. Setting the behavioral action. What is that? Explicit changes occurring in behavior is the main goal of learning process. A change in an individual's thought process or the attitudes without any changes in much explicit behavior will not be considered as a learning process. അതായത് കൂടുതൽ ചേഞ്ചസ് ആ ഒരു പ്രോസസ്സിലെ ആറ്റിറ്റ്യൂഡ് വരുന്നില്ല എങ്കിൽ then never that person's behavior will be changed. So that is the behavioral action should be set. And need for meaningful experiences. What is that? Some form of experience is necessary for learning. Experience may be directly acquired through observation. ഒരാളെ ഒബ്സർവ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് അല്ലെ through experience or the practice. Then in such a case, this will happen. So these are the salient features with regard to which one? Salient features with regard to learning. One is change process, another one is a permanent change, another one is setting the behavioral action and a meaningful experience. അതിന്റെ ആവശ്യകത, അതായത് observing or through proper practice, his or her behavior will be changed accordingly. So next process is what? Next we see the learning process in OB. What are the learning processes? Like the stimulus, the response, then the motivation and the rewards. So these are the learning process in OB. Stimulus. Stimulus is what? It is a motivation or an incentive to the learner. Stimulus means a motivation or an incentive, prachodhanam, uttejanam. Okay? Adana to the learner. ആരാണോ പഠിക്കുന്നത് അവർക്ക് ഒരു what it should be, a motivation towards that. So that is the which one? Stimulus. Then the response. From that stimulus, response occurs. The result generating from such a stimuli. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു മോട്ടിവേഷൻ അല്ലെ ഒരു ഇൻസെന്റീവ് അതിൽ നിന്ന് റിസൾട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന what is the benefit occurred or benefit got, that is the response, the result obtained, not the rewards. The result obtained, that is the which one? Response. Next is the motivation, the inspiring ability or the inspiring thing that a person should learn, that is the motivation. എന്ത് കാരണങ്ങൾ കൊണ്ടാണ് ആ വ്യക്തി പഠിക്കാൻ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത്, means to learn something, means to acquire the knowledge, that is the motivation. And the rewards, based on the motivation, what are the rewards generated or what are the rewards they got it? Maybe it is a monetary reward, if it is a which one? Salary increment, or non-monetary reward, maybe praising the other person or praising someone in those who participated in a social work. Maybe he or she may got praised. So the stimulus, the response, the motivation and the rewards, these are the four learning process towards the OB. So this much we discussed yesterday, like what is a learning or what is the definition with regard to learning, then what are the factors with regard to learning, and then the learning process. So today we are going to see what is that, what are the types of learning or the theories with regard to learning. So what are the theories with regard to learning? So what are the theories? There are four theories that represents learning. One is the classical conditioning. Another one is the operant conditioning. Another one is the social learning. Cognitive theory. Third one is and fourth one is social learning. So these are the theories with regard to learning. So what is a classical conditioning? So classical conditioning is one of the main theory with regard to learning. So what is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is based on the assumption that a physical event which is called a stimuli that initially does not bring about a particular response, slowly it acquires the capacity to bring out that response as a result of the repeated interaction. So what is that? It is the assumption that a physical event, എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു happening, ഒരു event happens, okay? Based on that, firstly, its response is there, that slowly acquires the capacity to bring out that response based on a repeated interaction. വീണ്ടും വീണ്ടും ആ സെയിം കൃത്യം തന്നെ ചെയ്ത് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു റെസ്പോൺസ് അതിൽ നിന്ന് കിട്ടുന്നു. ആ ഇതാണ് എന്തെന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ക്ലാസിക്കൽ കണ്ടീഷനിങ്. സോ വൺസ് അഗെയിൻ classical conditioning is based on the assumption that a physical event which is called a stimuli that we see yesterday, that is the motivation or the incentive to do or to learn that process, that is the stimuli. So which is called a stimuli that initially does not bring, firstly this happening of an event, it does not have a response. Slowly next time there is some response, third time there is also some response, so and finally that response occur, result is occurring there. Okay, so which is called a stimulus that initially does not bring out a particular response, that slowly acquires the capacity to bring out that response as a result of the repeated interaction. Learning of this type is very common and plays an important role in generating the reactions such as fear, panic, nervousness, smile, and joy. So what all are the things? Learning is of this type. Operant classical conditioning type learning will help in removing the fear, panic, situation panic ആകുമ്പോൾ we need to be എന്താണ് calm, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കൂടുതൽ പ്രശ്നമാകും അതാണ്. So nervousness, the smile, and also the joy. So this type of learning will is very common, play is an important role in generating the reactions such as fear, panic, nervousness, smile, and joy. So classical conditioning was developed by Ivan Pavlov. There is a famous Nobel Prize winning psychologist. So this is very important, this theory. Ivan Pavlov, famous psychologist who win Nobel Prize also. So Ivan Pavlov, a famous Nobel Prize winning psychologist. The theory deals with the association of one event with another desired event resulting in a desired behavior of learning. So ഒരു ഇവന്റ് കൊണ്ട് അതിന്റെ കണ്ടിന്യൂസ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഇവന്റ് എവറി ഡേ കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്യുന്നതുകൊണ്ട് മേ ബി ദ ബിഹേവിയർ വിൽ desired behavior will occur. That is the Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning theory. So for that purpose, Pavlov conducted an experiment. So we look into that, the experiment. Pavlov conducted an experiment on a dog to study the relation between salivation of the dog and ringing of a bell. So ഒരു experiment നടത്തി with a dog. Okay, so to study the relation between what salivation of a dog and ringing of a bell. Ringing of a bell. So Pavlov conducted an experiment relating to on a dog to study the relation between what is the salivation of a dog. അതായത് സലൈവ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ പട്ടിക്ക് വായിൽ എന്ത് വരുന്നു വെള്ളം വരുന്നതും and also ഒരു bell ring ചെയ്യുന്നതും. What is that? Firstly, when Pavlov presented a piece of meat to the dog, he noticed a so here Pavlov conducted an experiment in a dog to study the relation between the salivation of the dog and ringing of a bell. So what is this? How or why the dog is getting salivated, on what basis? If he shows something, the dog gets salivated, and if he rang a bell, why the dog is not salivated firstly? Later on, the dog is getting salivated, or dog is getting salivated if the bell rings itself. So what is there? It is something there in that. That through this classical conditioning experiment, this experiment, he is describing the classical condition. So what is that? Firstly, when Pavlov presented a piece of meat to the dog, he noticed a great deal of salivation in the dog. പട്ടിക്ക് എന്ത് കൊടുത്തു? ഒരു കഷ്ണം ഇറച്ചി കൊടുത്തു. ഇറച്ചി കൊടുത്തപ്പോ the dog is getting salivated. He termed food as an unconditional stimulus because without any condition the dog is getting stimulated, salivated, okay, or stimulated in the sense means what? The dog is getting salivation because whenever he show a piece of meat to the dog is getting salivated. So it is an unconditional stimulus, and salivation as an unconditional response. When the dog saw the meat, it gets salivated. അപ്പോൾ ഇറച്ചി കഷ്ണം കണ്ടു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ പട്ടി എന്ത് ചെയ്യുന്നു? വായിൽ വെള്ളം വരും. Isn't it? So the thing that showed the meat is the stimuli, and the response is what? The salivation of the dog. In the second stage, Pavlov merely rang a bell. ഒരു bell അടിച്ചു. So it is the neutral stimulus, means ആ ആദ്യത്തെ സ്റ്റിമുലസിലോട്ടുള്ള ഒരു വഴിയാണ്. And the dog did not salivate. In such a case, the dog is not salivated if he rang the bell. Then Pavlov subsequently introduced the sound of the bell each time the meat was given to dog. അപ്പോൾ എന്താ ചെയ്ത പുള്ളി? Dog salivation എപ്പോഴാണ്? When he show a piece of meat, the dog is getting salivated. So that the piece of the meat is the stimuli, and the response is what? The dog is getting salivated. After that, what it occurs? At the time of showing the meat, he also rang a bell. Then the dog is firstly not salivated. Later on, Pavlov introduced the sound of the bell each time the meat was given to the dog. Thus, meat and ringing of the bell were linked together. That is, the bell rang and meat also showing, so that the dog knows that it is the time to get the food. Isn't it? So that is, Pavlov subsequently introduced the sound of a bell each time the meat was given to the dog. Therefore, meat and ringing of the bell were linked together, and the dog eventually learned to salivate in response to the ringing of the bell, even when there was no meat. അപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്ന ഇതാണ്, classical condition എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്താണ്? There should be some stimuli, and based on the stimuli, at the first instance, the person is not getting any response. Later on, the same happening, then some response is there. Like the same, he did an experiment with a dog. When he show a piece of meat, the dog is getting salivated at the first instance. Correct or not? Yes. Then, at the same time, when he rang a bell and didn't show the piece of the meat, the dog is not salivated at the first instance. Then he thought that there is something with related to these two. What he did this way. He rang the bell at the time, every time he is showing or he is giving the piece of meat, then dog is getting salivated. So first instance, the dog is not salivated because the dog doesn't know that it is the time for food, or there is a stimuli in that. Later on, the same case happened that he rang the bell, also he is showing the piece of meat. So both at the same time, and it should be linked together, the dog is getting salivated, even though there is no piece of meat. So that is the classical conditioning. Hope you got the main content with regard to this. So Ivan Pavlov, a Nobel Prize winner psychologist, did the experiment in where? Did the experiment in a dog. Clear? That is, there is a stimuli. What is that? Showing a piece of meat. The motivation to the dog that he is getting food. So that what is occurred? The response is what? The dog is getting salivated. Clear? The dog is getting salivated. Later, he rang a bell instead of showing a piece of meat, or instead of giving a piece of meat. The dog is not salivated. There is no response. from the dog. Result is not there from the dog. Later, he linked together, that is showing a piece of meat or giving a piece of meat with ringing a bell. In such a case, dog is getting salivated at the next instant, so that there should be some linked with this one. So where is that? A response is there when stimuli is continuing, and even though that stimuli is not there, there is another thing, that is neutral stimuli, that is the ringing of the bell. Instead of showing a piece of meat, he rings the bell. Then the dog knows that it is the time for food, or it is the response is there from the dog, that the dog is getting salivated. So this is the case with regard to classical conditioning. Hope you know now what is the classical conditioning. So firstly, there is a stimuli, and at the first instance there is no response, isn't it? There is no response from the dog. Salivated at what time? When he show the meat, the dog is getting salivated. Next time, when he rang the bell, dog is not salivated, because neutral stimuli is there, but the response is not from the dog. But later on, what this Ivan Pavlov did, he linked together the salivation, that's not the salivation, the ringing of the bell and the giving a piece of meat or showing a piece of meat linked together. Then the dog noticed that this is the response from the dog, that the dog is getting salivated. So this is the, even though he is not, later on, even though he is not showing a piece of meat, when the bell rang, dog is getting salivated. So neutral stimuli becomes the stimuli later, and the response is there. So that is the classical conditioning. Hope you understand this classical conditioning. Next, what are the framework with regard to this classical conditioning? So we will look into that. The framework of classical conditioning of behavior is, before the conditioning, unconditional stimuli, that is the, which one? Without any condition. Okay, ringing the bell. Then unconditional stimuli result in unconditional response. In the experiment by the Pavlov, meat is an unconditional stimuli that creates an unconditional response also. Without any condition, the dog is getting salivated when he show a piece of meat. So, students, this framework with regard to the classical conditioning, under that, before the conditioning, with that condition, either ringing the bell, the dog is getting salivated, or showing a piece of meat, the dog is also getting salivated. So before the conditioning, the unconditional stimulus, that is the meat, on what basis the dog is getting salivated? Due to showing of meat. And the response, unconditional response, what is that? Salivation. So in the experiment conducted by Pavlov, meat is an unconditional stimulus which creates an unconditional response. A neutral stimuli, that is the bell, doesn't create any response. There is no response from the dog when the bell rang, instead of showing the meat at the first instance. There is no response. Later on, the dog knows that ringing the bell is equal to what? Getting food. So the dog is getting salivated. So that is the first thing. During the conditioning, unconditional stimulus and a conditional stimulus causes a response. So meat and ringing the bell. So meat is the unconditional stimulus, and the conditional stimulus is what? The ringing the bell will cause salivation, the unconditional response in the dog. So what is that? Conditioned stage, before conditioning, what is the stage? Unconditional stimuli results in unconditional response. Like showing the piece of meat, okay, and ringing the bell is nothing related to that. Instead of showing the piece of meat, if he rang the bell at the first instance, dog is not getting salivated. That is before conditioning. after the condition or during the conditioning stage, അതായത് ഈ ഇതില് ഇടയ്ക്ക് unconditional stimulus and a conditional stimulus that causes the response. Unconditional stimulus and a conditional stimulus causes the response. For example, the dogs in the Pavlov's experiment, meat and ringing of the bell causes the salivation in the dog. അതായത് രണ്ടും കൂടെ ഈ കണ്ടീഷനിങ്ങിന്റെ സമയത്ത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ in between the conditioning, so that ringing the bell and showing the piece of meat will result in dog salivation. And after the conditioning, conditional stimulus results in unconditional response. That is, the bell causes salivation in the dog at the last stage. അതാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്, at the first stimuli there is no response. Later on it is getting responded. So that is this one, classical conditioning. Clear, students? So once again, what is the classical conditioning? The stimuli first, at the first instance, the stimuli is showing there is no response. Later on, the stimuli is based on the stimuli showing, or based on the motivation or the incentive. That is the stimuli. What is that? Results in response or result. So for this purpose, Ivan Pavlov, a noted Nobel psychologist, Nobel Prize winner psychologist, framed or formulated this theory, classical conditioning. Under that, at the first instant, he show a piece of meat, the dog is getting salivated. Clear? When he rang a bell, the dog is not getting salivated at the first instant. Later on, he noticed that when he linked together ringing the bell and showing the piece of meat, dog is getting salivated. Later on, at the last stage, even though he is not showing any piece of meat, only ringing the bell, then dog gets salivated. So what is that? The conditional stimuli, that is what? Ringing the bell. Bell മണി അടിക്കുമ്പോ പട്ടിക്ക് എന്ത് തോന്നുന്നു? പട്ടിക്ക് വായിൽ വെള്ളം വരും. Because the dog knows that this is the thing when giving a piece of meat, the time for giving the piece of meat. So the conditional stimuli based on the unconditional response. That is, what is the unconditional response from the first to the last? Salivation of dog. But condition is what? Ringing of the bell or ringing the bell. So that is the classical conditioning. So next is what? Operant conditioning. So classical conditioning based on the condition, unconditional response occur. എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എപ്പോഴും മണി അടിക്കുമ്പോൾ പട്ടിക്ക് എന്ത് വായിൽ വെള്ളം ഒഴിക്കുന്നു. Because the dog thought that the owner is giving the meat. So instead of he is showing any meat, the dog is getting salivated because of the ringing of the bell. Then it is quite different from that operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is defined as the second theory, operant conditioning. So who is the who is formulated this classical conditioning theory? Ivan Pavlov. Okay, write the name, Ivan Pavlov. Why? Operant conditioning formulated by B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner. So operant conditioning is defined as the behavior that produces the effect. Operant conditioning was developed by B.F. Skinner, who advocated that people exhibit the responses that are rewarded and will not exhibit the response that are either not rewarded or getting punished. So what is that? Operant conditioning was developed by Skinner, who advocated that people should exhibit the response, means show the result. Response is what? The result. The people should exhibit, means show the results occurred that are getting rewarded, and if they are not showing, that is getting punished or not rewarded. So OC, also called operant conditioning, called the instrument conditioning, which refers to the process that behavior produces certain consequences, certain impact on the behavior. That is, behavior produces certain consequences, and how a person behaves in future, that will depend on those consequences. So operant conditioning is also called instrument conditioning, which refers to the process that the behavior produces certain consequences. Then എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു behavior produce അതിന് എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു next effect ഉണ്ടാകും. അതായത് whether it is a bad thing or a good thing, whatever be, there should be some result. And how a person behaves in future will depend on that consequence. അതിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്താണ്, ആ ഒരു റിസൾട്ടിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്താണ് he or she may respond in future. Okay, so that is the operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is also called instrument conditioning, which refers to the process that the behavior that produces certain consequences is there. Consequences means the result, and how a person behaves in future will depend on such consequences. If action have a pleasant effect, then people will be more likely to repeat them in future. ഒരു നല്ല റിസൾട്ട് ആണ് വരുന്നതെങ്കിൽ again and again he or she will do, or he or she will continue the same behavior. Unpleasant ആണല്ലോ, good result അല്ല, bad ആണല്ലോ, never likely to repeat that thing in future. അല്ലേ? They are not interested in repeating that same incident if the result is not a good one. If it is a good one, will get or will be interested in repeating that thing. So that is the operant conditioning as per B.F. Skinner. അതായത് ഒരു good response കിട്ടുകയാണെങ്കിൽ he or she may do again and again in the near future, while opposite is the case, never repeat that, or he or she doesn't like to repeat that thing. That is the operant conditioning. Therefore, however, the action with the unpleasant effects are less likely to repeat in future. Thus, according to the operant conditioning, behavior is the function of its consequences. So behavior is what? As per him, behavior based is the result of what? The consequences. എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ആ ഒരു ഇതിന്ന് ഉണ്ടാകുന്ന ഭവിഷ്യത്ത് എന്താണോ അതിന്റെ ബേസിലായിരിക്കും വീണ്ടും അതിനെപ്പറ്റി ചെയ്യണോ വേണ്ടയോ എന്നുള്ള ഒരു ചിന്തിക്കും. അതാണ്. Therefore, behavior, as per the operant conditioning, behavior is the function of its consequences. അതായത് അതിന്റെ ഫംഗ്ഷൻ, അത് ആ എന്താണ് എന്താണ് റിസൾട്ട്, ആ റിസൾട്ടിന്റെ based on the function of the result, behavior occurs. So this is as per the B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is defined as the behavior that produces the effect. Effect in the sense means the result. If there is a good result, it will be repeating in the near future, and vice versa. If it is a bad one, not interested in repeating that in the near future. Adana as per B.F. Skinner's definition, or B.F. Skinner's theory with regard to learning. So operant conditioning is, once again we will look into, operant conditioning is defined as the behavior that produces the effect. Therefore, it was developed by B.F. Skinner, who advocated that people exhibit the responses, means the result. People who show that result will be getting rewarded, and if they are not showing, they will be penalized or not getting any reward. Therefore, it is the instrument conditioning based on the instrument. What is the instrument there to do that thing? And based on the result occurred, whether he or she will continue in the near future or to remain silent in doing that thing. So that is the case. So OC is also called the instrument conditioning that refers to the process that the behavior produces certain consequences, and how a person behaves in the future, that will depend on such consequences. If the action have a pleasant effect, then it will be repeating in the near future, and if it is an unpleasant effect, never doing in the near future, or less likely to repeat. That are less likely to repeat in the near future. Therefore, OC behavior is the function of its consequences as result. Next, we are going to see the type of behavior. See, work or job, then what is the consequence? Wage or salary and other benefits. If they are not good in work, they will get less wages and they are not at all interested. Correct or not? Like the same, talking to others, what is that? Social relation. Visiting the restaurant, for whom, for what purpose? Food and beverage. അതായത് എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു ആക്ഷനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്ത് അതിന്റെ റിസൾട്ട് ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കും. അതാണ് ബിഹേവിയറിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്ത് അതിന്റെ റിസൾട്ട് ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കും. ആ റിസൾട്ടിനെ ആ റിസൾട്ടിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്താണ് വീണ്ടും ആ ബിഹേവിയർ കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്യണോ എന്നുള്ളത് നോക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ബിഹേവിയർ ഈസ് ദി function of its consequences എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. So visiting the restaurant, food and beverage, library, reading the books, watching cinema, entertainment is there, joining the school, acquisition of knowledge. Some examples are there. So today we see what all things: operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, there is a stimuli, then based on the stimuli, at the first instance there is no response, later on it is getting responded. That is with the example of the dog. Ivan Pavlov formulated this theory, and he propounded this, and he exhibit that thing with regard to that in the which one classical